Even though today's hardware components are very reliable, it doesn't mean that they'll last forever. And so we need to understand how to apply the troubleshooting methodology to problems related to motherboards, CPUs, and RAM. The first possible symptom we might encounter would be post beeps or messages on the screen or even light indicators depending on the machine. Now post stands for power on self-test. It's part of the firmware instruction set inside a device that gets triggered when you turn on the power. And its primary purpose is to make sure that components are present, like a keyboard or a mouse or a video display, a processor, and not only to make sure they're there, but to make sure that they are functioning. Another possible symptom would be a blank screen upon boot. Now that could mean a lot of things, including something as simple as the monitor not being turned on, or perhaps the monitor not being plugged in. But in some cases, if we've got a problem with the video card, the video display adapter in the machine, that will normally be accompanied with some power on self-test or post beep sounds. The next thing that we might run into are Windows system lockups. That's the blue screen of death, the BSOD. Pictured on the screen, we have an example of a Windows 10 blue screen of death, where we have a blue screen, we have an unhappy face that tells us our PC ran into a problem and needs to restart. Now, if you've got the latest Windows updates applied, you'll also have a QR code on the screen seen here. Now, you might use your smartphone with a scanning app to scan that QR code that will take you to a web link that will give you more details about what might have caused the blue screen of death and how you might resolve the issue. The next possible symptom would be random reboots or shutdowns. I've seen this many times in the past, and it was usually due to a problem with the machine going into sleep mode and not waking up and sometimes randomly rebooting. I've also seen this as a result of some problem with the motherboard, where a replacement of the entire motherboard solved the problem. So there are some things to watch out for when it comes to random reboots or shutdowns. Of course, at the same time, it could also be completely software-based, so we have to apply the troubleshooting methodology to determine which probable cause is the most likely. The next thing to bear in mind is CPU overheating. Now, you'll see this a lot in higher-end machines where people like gamers try to push the CPU to run even faster than it's been officially rated to go. And this is called overclocking. Now, when you overclock a CPU, you're taking chances because often you're voiding the warranty on it if something happens. But at the same time, even if you're not overclocking, your CPU could overheat. And what normally will happen if it gets too warm, maybe due to ambient room temperature, is that the CPU will throttle itself. It'll slow down, and you'll notice it, to the point where it might even just shut off. Finally, on the Mac OS, you might also get system lockups. On the Mac OS, this is referred to as an SPOD, and that really stands for the spinning pinwheel of death, because that's the symbol you get on the screen when this kind of problem occurs. Now, many different BIOS manufacturers have their own system of beep codes that have differing meanings. In this example, let's take a look at some standard Dell BIOS beep codes that you might get if there's a problem detected during the post, the power on self-test. So if we get one beep on a Dell BIOS, it normally means that we've got a failure with the BIOS itself. That's not good because the BIOS is soldered right onto the motherboard, and normally it means replacing the entire motherboard. Two beeps means we've got a RAM detection failure, and it could be as simple as the RAM chips are not fully seated tightly within their sockets. Three beeps means a motherboard failure. Four is a RAM failure as opposed to detection. Five beeps means a CMOS battery failure. Now, you'll probably know that you have an issue because every time you power on the machine, it might reset the date and time, and that usually means the CMOS battery is failing. Six beeps would mean a video card failure. Again, it could be a problem with the card itself, or maybe the card isn't seated fully and properly into its socket. Whereas 7 beeps would mean a CPU failure. So this is just to give you a sense of what you might expect in terms of audible signals that there's a problem with the machine. Now, pictured on the screen, we obviously have a problem. We've got a failed motherboard that's on fire. Now, that's an easy one to determine. Burning, smell, smoke, things on fire, obviously they are a problem and need to be replaced. But if you look carefully at the cylindrical items on the motherboard, these are capacitors. And specifically, if it looks like it's bloated and the top has been partially blown off, what this is referred to is as a distended capacitor. So capacitors are designed to hold a charge, but sometimes if there's a problem with the motherboard or if there's a design flaw in the motherboard, they end up getting bloated or distended. And you can see this even visually. When this happens, you definitely need to replace the motherboard. Solving problems such as these could involve replacing the actual faulty or problematic component, like the MOBO or motherboard, the CPU, or the RAM. And sometimes if you replace the motherboard, you don't have a choice. You also have to replace the CPU and RAM if the stuff on your old motherboard won't plug into your new motherboard. We might consider disabling CPU overclocking if we're having overheating issues, if the CPU has been overclocked. On older machines, you can do that with jumpers and dip switches that you can set right on the motherboard physically. Newer machines allow you to do that in the BIOS or UEFI settings. If you suspect you've got a problem with RAM chips, you might conduct a RAM test. There are free utilities to do this, and it's even built into some operating systems, such as Windows 10 or Windows Server 2016. Now bear in mind that it's very easy to fry circuits such as RAM chips if you have electronic static discharge. So if you are not grounded properly and you're not at equal voltage with other items that you touch, then the flow of electrons from you to them could fry them, including RAM chips. If we have the BIOS date and time that keeps getting reset, well, that usually means you need to replace the CMOS battery. And of course, we can look to log entries related to hardware failures for motherboard, CPU, and RAM to help give us an idea as to what the problem is. So, for example, let's say we look at a Windows machine and we've got a Windows kernel event ID item of 41. Now, Windows Event ID 41 means that the system just rebooted without shutting down cleanly, and that could be indicative of a problem, for example, with a motherboard. Pictured on the screen, we have an example of conducting a RAM test. Even if you initiate this from within, let's say, Windows Server 2016, it's going to have to reboot your machine so that Windows isn't running and using a lot of the memory in order to properly conduct the RAM test.